In this lecture, I will focus on the conception of God in the Quran. I will essentially argue that God is the most important theme in the Quran alongside his relationship with humanity. This lecture will explore a number of issues related to God in the Quran. The Arabic term Allah for God, the different names of God that describe his attributes, some of the more controversial issues around the conception of God, like whether God can be considered male or female, and some of the anthropomorphic understandings of God, which rely on using human attributes to describe God. Let us look at the issue of God as the key theme of the Quran. Having read some of the Quran by now, can it easily be broken up into themes? Can you identify where in the Quran a certain topic is being addressed? Or is it more complex than that? As you become more familiar with the Quran, I think you will notice that particular themes in the Quran are not always in one place, in just a few chapters. For example, you won't easily find a separate philosophical section or a theological section which will discuss God's attributes, or a legal section in the Quran discussing legal issues. It's all intertwined. Having said this, though, you can see different emphases in the Quran. The various themes the Quran covers are scattered throughout the text. It just takes a little more work to draw them out compared to another kind of text. The standard list of themes identified in the Quran usually begins with the theme of God. Following this is usually the theme of God's activity in the world, including his creation and his relationship with humanity. And after this is usually the theme of the prophets and the messengers as those who communicated God's message. The final theme is usually ethics, law, and society more broadly. But what do we mean when we say theme? When we talk about the themes of the Quran, we are speaking about the messages related to broader topics that the Quran is attempting to convey. So there are many themes to be found in the Quran, but today we'll focus on what many believe to be the most important and fundamental, that is, God. Let us now look at the term Allah, and let us move to look at how the theme of God is reflected in the Quran. We will do this firstly by thinking about the word Allah, the Arabic word for God or the God. There is some controversy around the word Allah. Do you know why? Well, the debate centers on whether the word Allah refers to God and therefore can refer to any conception of God, whether Christian, Jewish, or otherwise. Or does the word Allah only refer to the God of Islam? Or, as some people would say, the Muslim God, so to speak. Because of this, questions around who can use the word Allah have come up. For example, some Muslims argue that Christians can't use the term Allah to refer to God. This happened, for example, in a country like Malaysia a few years ago. The Catholic Church in Malaysia argued that Christians have always used the word Allah for God and challenged the Malaysian government, which had banned them from using the term. The issue was in court for several years. However, in 2014, Malaysia's highest court ruled that non Muslims, in this case the Christians, could not use the word Allah to refer to God, particularly in their literature. The key reason for that was because the authorities feared that Muslims in Malaysia might get confused when reading non Muslim literature, in this case Christian literature, and may convert to another religion. This kind of conversion by Muslims is a crime in Malaysia. But in most modern Christian and Jewish Arabic usage, this use of the term Allah to refer to God isn't really an issue. Allah means simply the God. And that is the term you will find in the Arabic translation of the New Testament, for example. Similarly, if we look at the ancient classical Jewish texts that talk about God, they also would use the term Allah. For many Arab Christians, for example, the use of Allah to refer to God may not be an issue at all. So, using a linguistic line of argument, the term Allah is not perhaps considered a proper name as such. For many, Allah is actually two Arabic words put together. Al, which in Arabic equates to the, and Ilah, I-L-A-H, which in Arabic equates to God. So one could say, for example, the word Allah means simply the God. When Muslims use it, it refers to the Muslim conception of God. When a Christian refers to it, it refers to a Christian conception of God. In this sense, then, Allah is not necessarily referring to a Muslim God, so to speak. In the Quran, it makes it very clear that God of Muslims is the God of the Jews and also the God of Christians. The Quran does have concerns about how some people of other faiths might conceptualize God, but this is a slightly different issue. Further distinctions can also be made, however. In the Quran, the term Ilah, I-L-A-H, is used for the word any God, and Allah is used to refer to a supreme deity, or in other words, the real God, the creator and sustainer. From a historical perspective, it seems that the pre Islamic Arabs were quite familiar with the notion of a supreme deity known as Allah. This is reflected in chapter 29 of verse 61, which says, "If you ask them," meaning the pre Islamic Arabs, "who created the heavens and the earth and subjected the sun and the moon, they would surely say, Allah." Let me now quote a fatwa or an Islamic legal opinion saying Muslims should not use the word God to translate the word Allah. And I quote, "As for translating the name Allah with God, while translating the meaning of the Quran or Hadith books or books of Islamic knowledge, we do not think that this is permissible. Rather, it is our obligation to leave the name of Allah in its original form as it is pronounced Allah. This is because the name Allah is the proper name of our Lord, Allah. The name Allah is different from the word God, which only means a deity." What do you think about this fatwa? What are the problems in translating Allah to God in English? Let us now look at God's most beautiful names as this is expressed in the Islamic tradition. I would like now to turn more specifically to the ways in which the Quran refers to God, which is to describe his descriptive attributes or qualities. What are these descriptive attributes? A good example is the Quranic verse which says, "Indeed, God is the forgiving, the merciful." This verse or expression can be found in many places of the Quran. For example, chapter 3, verse 31. The most commonly cited names or attributes for God are the forgiving, the merciful, and the compassionate, or according to other translations, the most gracious and most merciful. These words form the basis of the formula or the basmala in Arabic, which is Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, which begins every chapter of the Quran, except, of course, chapter 9. But there are many names attributed to God in the Quran, too many for me to go into here now. Let us look at the attributes of God, and let me point you to a useful way of categorizing them. Muslim theologians often divided the attributes or the names of God into two categories: names or attributes of majesty or Jalal in Arabic, Jalal Jalal, and the names of beauty or Jamal in Arabic. Jamal is Jamal. Jalal means majesty, Jamal means beauty. Some might suggest that the split here runs down traditional masculine feminine lines. So you have, for example, names such as Al Malik, which means the king, and Al Jalil, which means the mighty, which might be classified traditionally as masculine attributes. Then you have names such as Al Wadud, which means the loving, which might be classified as more feminine traditionally. Here is a Quranic verse that captures lots of attributes of God. Chapter 59, verses 22 to 24. He is God, there is no God but He, knower of the unseen and the seen. He is the compassionate, the merciful. He is God, there is no God but He, the King, the Holy, the source of peace, the faithful, the preserver, the mighty, the compeller, the sublime. Glory be to God. Above that they associate. He is God, the creator, the maker, the shaper. To him belongs the most beautiful names. All that is in the heavens and the earth glorifies him. He is the mighty, the wise. You can see that this verse is almost like a hymn. It has three parts, each starting with the phrase, He is God. It is a kind of litany that covers many of the different divine attributes of God. Another good example is the verse called the verse of the throne, or Ayatul Kursi in Arabic. Let me read it. You can find it in the Quran in chapter 2, verse 255. God, there is no God but He, the living, the everlasting. Slumber seizes him not, nor sleep. To him belongs all that is in the heavens and the earth. Who is there that shall intercede with him save by his leave? He knows what lies before them and what is after them, and they comprehend not anything of his knowledge save such as he wills. His throne encompasses the heavens and the earth. The preserving of them wearies him not. He is the Most High, the Glorious. You will often find this verse, that is the throne verse, written in Muslim homes on the walls in beautiful calligraphy. It's a piece of art, a piece of sacred art. The verse is considered by Muslims to have special powers of protection against evil. It's one that emphasizes God's power and His majesty. A question for us is, can one refer to God using words like He or His? Why refer to God using words that are for males? In the Quran, God is always referred to by the masculine pronoun, He or His. But that does not necessarily mean that God is considered a man or like a man, or that God is male in character. But in Muslim tradition, many mystics or Sufis tend to use what we may refer to as feminine words when they refer to God. You can see this in Sufi poetry a lot. Let's explore this issue a little bit further. In case you don't know, all nouns in Arabic are gendered. So, for example, the word for sun is shams, Shams, which is an Arabic word for sun. And this is a feminine noun. That is, Shams is a feminine noun. While the word for moon, that is Qamar, Qamar, is masculine. So in this grammatical context, the noun God is considered masculine. There is no particular reason why the word Shams or sun has to be masculine or feminine, or the moon has to be masculine or feminine. But that is how in Arabic language words are used. Gender is very important when it comes to Arabic language usage. Let us consider the two most commonly cited attributes of God: the most gracious, the most merciful. In Arabic, this refers to Ar-Rahman and Ar-Rahim. Both of these words have a very strong connotations to the Arabic word Rahim, Rahim, which means the womb or womb, WOMB. There is clearly a female connection here. The word is specifically tied to bringing life into the world. In other words, there is a blurring between the so-called masculine and feminine attributes of God. In fact, you would be hard-pressed to find theologically sound arguments that insist on God being simply masculine. For Muslim theologians, God is not male or female. These are human attributes and not of God. This brings us to a much bigger point, that's much more important point. Can God be described using human attributes or descriptions at all? Is God comparable to human beings? The Quran seems to argue that God is not comparable to humans at all. God cannot be conceived as anything like a human. One of the Quranic verses says that there is nothing similar or comparable to God. Let us look at this very important verse, which is called the verse of light. Let me read the verse. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. The example of His light is like a niche within which is a lamp. The lamp is within glass. The glass as if it were a pearly white star, lit from the oil of a blessed olive tree, neither of the east nor of the west, whose oil would almost glow even if untouched by fire, light upon light. Allah guides to His light whom He wills, and Allah presents examples for the people, and Allah is knowing of all things. So, Quranic verses like this suggest that there is nothing like God. God transcends all that we as human beings can possibly conceptualize, think of, or imagine, except, of course, through the beauty of a poetic metaphor. For example, in this case, comparing God to light. Now, let us look at the issue of God and children according to the Quran. There are verses in the Quran that take issue with the idea that God could have a son, such as, for example, there are verses in the Quran that take issue with the idea that God could have a son, such as Jesus in the Christian narrative. This is another way of saying God could not possibly have made a son because he is not human. He creates, and He creates in ways that are beyond our comprehension. A key chapter or surah in the Quran that touches on this point is Surah 112. It says, let me read. Say He is Allah, who is one, Allah the eternal refuge. He neither begets nor is born, nor is there to Him any equivalent. In traditional commentaries on the Quran, commentators suggest this chapter is equivalent in weight to 1/3 of the Quran. They argue that this chapter is extremely significant because of the topics it covers. So here we have the Quran saying God does not beget nor is He begotten, and there is none like Him. This basically addresses the practice of paganism where people worshipped multiple gods at the time the Quran was revealed. And also at the same time, it is dealing with the Christian doctrine of Trinity, for example, which speaks about God the Father and God the Son. According to the Quran, God is one and only one. This unity of God is emphasized throughout the Quran. So, continuing with this topic, let us look at this issue of describing God using human terms. In some cultures, God is presented as, for example, an old man sitting on a cloud. In some scriptures of other religions, God may be referred to using very human like attributes. So, for example, in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, we find this description of God, and I quote: Then the man and his wife heard the sound of the Lord God as he was walking in the garden in the cool of the day. This kind of description of God, that is, walking in the garden, is not found in the Quran. But this does not mean that there aren't references in the Quran that use terms that we often use for humans. There are references, for example, in the Quran to the face of God, hands of God, or God becoming angry and the like. This kind of language caused a lot of difficulties for many early Muslim theologians because God is unique and different to anything that is in the creation. And because of this, many theologians argued that such references should be understood or interpreted as metaphors. It's a way of speaking, so to speak. But they argue that we should not be thinking that God is like a human. Other Muslims wanted to affirm these very human like qualities and said that if God had used these terms to refer to him in the Quran, then there is nothing wrong in us also using these terms to refer to God. But then some said that we should not be asking how God has a face or hands or how he becomes angry. We don't know how. We do not know that because we do not have any experience of God. We haven't seen God. Let me present another way of looking at this issue. In the Quran, we find references to the face of God, for example. Face in Arabic is wajh, W-A-J-H. It is true that a face is a very human attribute. But there is an argument that references to the face in Arabic mean something metaphorical. In pre-Islamic Arabic, for example, face is often used to refer to being. So to turn toward someone's face, or wajh in Arabic, is to turn toward him or toward his being. Similar arguments can be made about references to God's hands in the Quran. Traditionally, hands refer to one's power or strength or ability, not necessarily to the actual body part. But this issue is a controversial issue in Islamic theology. Some Muslims say these kinds of references to God's body are only metaphorical, but others say they are not. For them, God has a face, but we should not ask how. Now, let me provide an example of a fatwa or an Islamic legal opinion that rejects the idea that God has a human face, or that we should actually think that God has a human face. The questioner poses this question. In the Quran, there are a lot of verses which refer to God's hand, face, eye, etc. What do they all mean? Dar al-Ifta in Egypt, which is the institution that issues such fatwas, the official body that issues such fatwas, answers, and I quote, "There is nothing like unto Allah. It is impermissible to believe that the image of Allah, the Almighty, resembles that of His created beings." Muslim scholars have two positions regarding the primary texts, that is, the Quran and the Sunnah, related to this issue. The two positions disregard the literal meaning of the texts due to the definitive evidences denoting the transcendence of God, the Almighty, above the attributes of His created beings. As per His words, there is nothing like unto Him. Quran 42 verse 11, and nor is there to him any equivalent. Quran 112 verse 4. As you can see, this issue of saying anything about God using words to refer to human beings is a very complex issue in Islam, and there are no easy answers. It is a very significant theological problem, and it remains so. Another way the Quran approaches the question of God and the issue of human like qualities can be seen in its treatment of the creation narrative. Are you familiar with the biblical creation narrative? Well, according to the Bible, God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days and then rests on the seventh day, which is the Sabbath, establishing himself upon his throne. You can find this in Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. You may want to read the text there online. Compare this with the creation narrative in the Quran. In the Quran, there is reference to God creating the heavens and earth in 6 days. In chapter 7, verse 54, the Quran says, "Indeed, your Lord is Allah, who created the heavens and earth in 6 days and then established himself above the throne." But there is no reference to the seventh day of rest. The question is, what does it imply to say that God is upon the throne? In the famous throne verse, which we looked at earlier in this lecture, it speaks of God on his throne. But what does that mean? This became quite an issue theologically for Muslims, and there are various hadiths or traditions of the Prophet that make reference to this or try and explain what this might mean. There is a hadith that states that when God sits on his throne, it squeaks like the saddle on the back of a camel. And let me quote the hadith. When he, meaning God, most blessed and exalted, sits on the kursi, which is the throne, a squeak is heard like the squeak of a new leather saddle. It is true that such hadiths exist, but hadith scholars would say that many such hadiths may not necessarily be reliable or authentic. And even if such hadiths are reliable or authentic, the vast majority of Muslim scholars would suggest that any such description of God should not be taken literally. Rather, they would say that they are examples of the Prophet using human language to describe something that is actually outside of human understanding, comprehension, or meaning. Again, the emphasis is on a metaphorical understanding of such texts rather than a literal understanding or reading. Let us now turn to some of the Quranic phrases that describe God's transcendence. The word transcendence literally means existence or experience beyond the normal or physical level. In the case of God, transcendence is the idea that God exists both above and independently from all creation. Or, in other words, God is not surrounded by the creation, nor does he dwell within it. He is wholly separate, distinct, independent, and superior over the entire universe. The opposite of transcendence is immanence. This means God is present in the universe, close to everything and everyone, not in a physical sense, but through God's knowledge and activity. This is about God's relationship to the world. So, while there are some verses in the Quran that possibly paint a picture of God as having some human qualities, there are many that emphasize the point of God being transcendent. For example, let us look at the chapter 57, verse 3, which says, "He is the first and the last. He is the manifest or outer, in Arabic al-Zahir, and unmanifest or inner, al-Batin." And in chapter 6, verse 103, it says, "Vision cannot encompass him," meaning God. Chapter 42, verse 2, it says, "There is nothing whatsoever like unto him." Despite these verses that emphasize that God has no similarity whatsoever to anything that exists in the creation, there have been Muslims who often speak of God as someone that is very close to us and very familiar to human beings. Sufis or Muslim mystics often use language in this way when they refer to God or talk about God. They may make reference to God as being the beloved and often use language as if they are referring to a human being or a person. Theologians, on the other hand, generally tend to minimize any such language where that is possible. Here, I'm quoting a text from the famous theologian Al-Ghazali from his Revival of the Religious Sciences. Ghazali died in 1111. Let me quote: "We attest that he," meaning God, "is not a body possessing form, not a substance restricted and limited. He does not resemble other bodies, either in limitation or in accepting division. He is not a substance, and substances do not exist in him. He is not an accident, and accidents do not exist in him. No, he resembles no entity, and no entity resembles him. Nothing is like him, and he is not like anything. Measure does not bound him, and boundaries do not contain him." Very strong statement on transcendence of God. So, moving away from arguments around the use of human language to refer to God, I would like to turn now to the Quranic conception of God as both just and merciful. You might already know that a very important part of the nature of God in the Quranic conception of God is his justice um, or his serving of justice. In the Quran, God is depicted as the most just. There are various passages that say things like, "No one shall be wronged. We will set up the scales of justice, and all the deeds will be weighed." Particularly in the verses that describe the judgment day, the Quran makes it clear that people will be made to stand before their Creator, that is God, and testify their actions. Often justice is juxtaposed with mercy, and we can see these references to mercy over and over again in the Quran. For example, in chapter 6, verse 54, the Quran says, and I quote, "And when those come to you who believe in our verses say, 'Peace be upon you, your Lord has decreed upon himself mercy, that any of you who does wrong out of ignorance and then repents after that and corrects himself, indeed he is forgiving and merciful.'" So we have in the Quran this tension between mercy and justice, which arguably suggests that in the end, God will be merciful over anything else. Let us look at God's signs and his activity in the world. To broaden our picture of God again, the Quran points to God's signs, which can also be taken to mean God's activity in the world. There are many references, especially in the Meccan chapters of surahs, to certain natural phenomena such as the sun, the moon, which call attention to God's activity or creation. So, just to take one example, the Quran says that among the signs of God are the night and the day, the sun and the moon, and so forth. You can find this in chapter 41, verse 37. The example is chapter 41, verse 53, which says, and I quote, "We will show them our signs in the horizons and within themselves until it becomes clear to them that it is the truth." All these natural phenomena are described as signs, which are called ayat in Arabic, A-Y-A-T, signs of God in creation. Similarly, each verse of the Quran is also labeled as an ayah, A-Y-A-H, which is a sign, meaning the signs that point the listener or reader toward God. So we have the signs in the creation and the signs in the Quran, or the book of creation, or the book that is recited, which is the Quran. It's an interesting way of using the word ayah or sign. And there are passages in the Quran that ask the reader to reflect, to think about these signs in the creation that will, according to the Quran, ultimately lead a person to God. So they are, in a sense, point us to God. The sun, the moon, the heavens, the stars, and also the various signs in one's body, for example. I would like to touch on one aspect of the creation story that is of human beings, which is told in the Quran. Let me draw your attention to this verse. In chapter 2, verse 31, the Quran says that God taught Adam the names. Let me quote the verse. And he, meaning God, taught Adam the names, all of them. Then he, God, showed them to the angels and said, "Inform me of the names of these if you're truthful." This is a very important verse in the creation story of the Quran. There's no indication of what these names are or to whom the names belong. But if you are familiar with Genesis, we know from this text it is Adam who is asked with naming all the birds and the fish, for example. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 2, it says, "He gave names to all the livestock, all the birds of the sky, and all the wild animals." In the Quran, however, who or what Adam is naming is not mentioned. But this task of naming is particularly significant because Adam, not the angels, had the knowledge to allow him to do this. In other words, Adam's capacity to name indicates there is something unique to him, a gift that God has given only to human beings. That is, Adam and then human beings. And in this context, the angels are told to prostrate to Adam, which is a way of God pointing out this uniqueness of humanity. This knowledge to name seems to be the key feature of humans that gave a somewhat unique position in creation. But what is it? Is it the ability to think? What could that be? Theologians do not have a clear answer, and the commentators on the Quran have different views as well. Here is Muhammad Asad, one of the commentators on the Quran, explaining this naming issue. And let me quote Asad. It may legitimately be inferred that the knowledge of all the names denotes here man's faculty of logical definition and thus of conceptual thinking. So for Asad, conceptual thinking is the critical issue. Another commentator, Maududi, says, and I quote, "Nomenclature is the means by which human mind grasps the knowledge of things. Hence, the whole information of man, in fact, consists of assigning names, that is, for things. Thus, teaching Adam the names of all things was meant to impart their knowledge to him." In both cases, both Asad and Maududi are trying to understand what this naming is in the creation story. A prominent Sufi theologian, Ibn Arabi, argues in one of his long works that it is about naming the different attributes of God and how they manifest in earthly life. So, in summary, this lecture was about one of the major themes of the Quran, that is God. I tried to explore the term or the use of the term Allah and what this means, and also the controversies around the use of the word Allah for God. I looked at God's attributes or beautiful names and how they are described in the Quran very briefly and how they are categorized. And I spent a bit of time looking at whether God can be spoken of using human attributes or human language, so to speak, and the different views around that controversy. Finally, I looked at some of God's attributes and how his acts are reflected in the world and in the Quran as science.
Thank you for watching. Stay tuned for more lectures in this series as we explore the Quran's history, themes, and interpretation, as well as related debates today. Subscribe and turn on notifications to catch the next lecture in the series.